There is a category of mistake that appears on no preparation list. It is not found in survival manuals, it is not discussed in specialized forums, and it is rarely mentioned in emergency response training. It is the silent mistake, the mistake that only reveals itself when it is already too late to correct it. That mistake has a simple name: forgetting about the animals. Not out of lack of love, not out of conscious negligence, but because of a planning pattern that places the human being at the center of every calculation and leaves the animal as a variable to be resolved later. The problem is that in real crises, later does not exist in the way we imagine it will. When the infrastructure of a city begins to fail, whether due to a prolonged blackout, a rupture in the supply chain, an extreme weather event, or an economic crisis that paralyzes commerce, the first signs appear in a subtle way. An empty shelf here, a delivery delay there, a pharmacy that does not carry the expected product. Most people interpret these signals as temporary inconveniences. And it is precisely in that interval, between the first signal and the actual perception of severity, that the most important decisions are made or lost. For pet owners, that interval is even more critical. Because while an adult person can improvise a meal with whatever is in the pantry, can ration water, can adapt their routine to the circumstances, the animal cannot do any of that. The dog does not know the crisis has begun. The cat does not understand that the food has run out. The bird does not notice that the room temperature is dropping. They depend entirely on whoever cares for them. And whoever cares for them is, in most cases, still trying to understand what is happening. In the first days of any prolonged crisis, human behavior follows a fairly predictable pattern. There is an initial phase of denial in which the situation is minimized and the hope for rapid normalization dominates decisions. Then comes the reaction phase, when the severity begins to be perceived and people rush to compensate for what they did not do before. Finally, there is the adaptation phase, when improvisation becomes routine and people learn to operate within the new limitations. The problem for domestic animals is that they pay the highest price precisely during the reaction phase, which is when the owner finally realizes they do not have enough food, that the animal's medication is running low, that the veterinarian is closed, that the pet store has no delivery, and that the available options are far fewer than they seem to be the day before. In the United States, this pattern has been documented across dozens of events: hurricanes, blizzards, regional blackouts, supply disruptions during the pandemic. In all of these cases, a significant portion of pet owners reported having no specific preparation to keep their animals for more than 48 hours. 48 hours. In crises that lasted days, weeks, sometimes months. To understand why this happens, it is necessary to examine how people think about domestic preparedness in general. Most pet owners who believe they are prepared base that belief on a set of assumptions that seem reasonable in everyday life, but that quickly fall apart under pressure. The first assumption is that of continuous availability. The person buys pet food every week or every 2 weeks, maintains a stock that lasts 3 to 5 days, and assumes there will always be somewhere to buy more. This logic works perfectly under normal conditions, but in a supply crisis, pet food shelves are emptied within the first few hours, frequently before the shelves of human food. This happens because pet owners tend to buy in large quantities once they perceive scarcity, which accelerates the depletion of available stock. The second assumption is that of immediate adaptability. Many owners believe that if the specific food their animal eats is not available, they can simply offer something else, human food or a different brand. In practice, an abrupt dietary transition in animals causes serious gastrointestinal problems. A dog that has always eaten a specific formulation of dry food and suddenly receives inappropriate food can develop severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration within hours. In a scenario where water is already a limited resource and the veterinarian is inaccessible, that problem becomes a crisis within the crisis. The third assumption is that special needs are irrelevant. Older animals, animals with chronic illnesses, animals that require continuous medication, are often the most ignored in preparation plans. The owner thinks, "I'll sort out the food situation, and that's enough." But the diabetic animal that does not receive insulin, the cat with renal insufficiency that requires a specific diet, the epileptic dog that depends on anticonvulsants, these animals do not survive negligence for very long, and veterinary medications are, in general, among the first things to disappear from pharmacies during a crisis, because the stock is always smaller than the suppressed demand. There is also a psychological dimension to this problem that is rarely discussed with the seriousness it deserves. The bond between humans and domestic animals is real, deep, and has measurable effects on human behavior under stress. Studies conducted after Hurricane Katrina in 2005 revealed that a significant portion of the people who refused to evacuate in time made that decision because there was no evacuation plan that included their animals. These people preferred to face the risk of the hurricane rather than abandon their pets. This is not irrationality. It is data about how emotional bonds interfere with the decision-making process under extreme conditions. And this data has direct practical implications. If the owner does not have a concrete plan for the animal, they will make suboptimal decisions for themselves in order to compensate for that gap. They will stay when they should leave. They will spend scarce resources inefficiently. They will prioritize the animal's immediate well-being at the expense of medium-term planning. The solution is not to eliminate that bond. The solution is to incorporate it into the plan. To treat the animal not as an emotional variable, but as a logistical dependency. In the same way that a person with a chronic medical condition needs to ensure a stock of their medication before a crisis, the pet owner needs to ensure the specific resources that animal depends on. The first axis of real preparation for domestic animals in crisis scenarios is food. And here the central principle is simple. The minimum reliable stock begins where the comfort stock ends. Most domestic preparedness experts recommend a 30-day supply for human consumption. For animals, the same logic applies, but with an additional layer of complexity. The issue of rotation. Dry food for dogs and cats has a shelf life that ranges between 12 and 18 months after opening, depending on the formulation. Wet food in cans can last between 2 and 5 years when sealed. This means it is possible to build a rotating and safe stock without significant waste, provided the owner establishes a discipline of consumption and replenishment. What does not work is static stockpiling, buying a large bag of food, storing it in a corner, and forgetting about it. This produces expired or deteriorated food precisely when it is most needed. Intelligent stockpiling is dynamic. The owner uses what they have, replenishes regularly, and always maintains a safety buffer that goes beyond immediate consumption. For animals that require specific foods, such as prescribed veterinary diets, the challenge is greater. These diets are not typically available in regular supermarkets, and in a supply crisis, specialized pet stores are either closed or have their stock depleted quickly. The only real solution is to maintain a larger stock from the outset, between 60 and 90 days of consumption, and to speak with the veterinarian about acceptable alternatives in case the primary product is unavailable. The second axis is water, and here there is a very common conceptual error. People calculate the water needs for themselves and forget to include their animals in that calculation. A medium-sized dog consumes between 0.5 and 1 liter of water per day under normal conditions. Under stress or heat, that consumption can double. An adult cat consumes between 200 and 300 milliliters per day. These numbers need to enter the domestic water stock calculation from the very beginning, not as a last-minute addition, but as part of the base planning. There is also the question of water quality. Domestic animals are sensitive to water quality, especially cats, which tend to reject water with an altered odor or taste. In scenarios where available water comes from alternative sources, such as collected rainwater, streams, or improvised reservoirs, The need for filtration and purification applies to both humans and animals. Giving contaminated water to an animal already under physiological stress is to accelerate a deterioration that may be irreversible. The third axis is health, and this is perhaps where most animal preparation plans present their most serious flaw. Animal health in crisis scenarios depends on three elements that are usually treated separately, but need to be planned together: medication, vaccination, and access to emergency care. Regarding medication, the principle is the same as for food. The stock must exist before the crisis. Veterinary medications for chronic conditions, such as diabetes, epilepsy, heart disease, kidney disease, hypothyroidism, need to be available in sufficient quantity to cover at least 30 days beyond normal consumption. This requires an active conversation with the veterinarian about the possibility of larger prescriptions, and in some cases, about generic alternatives that may be easier to stockpile. Regarding vaccination, the reasoning is preventive. Animals with current vaccinations have active immunity against diseases that become more common in crisis scenarios. When contact with unknown animals increases, when sanitary control decreases, and when access to medical care is restricted. Rabies, parvovirus, distemper, and leptospirosis are diseases that can be fatal in unvaccinated dogs. Ensuring that vaccinations are current before any crisis is one of the simplest and most frequently neglected preventive measures. Regarding access to emergency care, preparation means having a plan, not a hope. The plan includes knowing where emergency veterinarians are in the area, having their contacts saved, knowing which clinics operate 24 hours, and knowing what to do in the first hours of an animal medical emergency before professional care is possible. This includes having a veterinary first aid kit at home, with basic items such as bandages, antiseptic, thermometer, saline solution, and disposable syringes, as well as a reference guide for the most common procedures. The fourth axis is the environment, and this is perhaps the most underestimated of all. Domestic animals are far more sensitive to environmental variations than their owners typically perceive in everyday life, because in everyday life, those variations are controlled. The home temperature is regulated by air conditioning or central heating. Lighting is controlled by electric illumination. The noise level is relatively stable. In a crisis that interrupts the supply of electrical power, all of these variables change simultaneously, and the animal has no rapid adaptation mechanisms. Brachycephalic dogs, such as bulldogs and pugs, are extremely vulnerable to heat and can develop fatal heat stroke within just a few hours of exposure to elevated temperatures without adequate ventilation. Long-haired cat breeds also have reduced heat tolerance. Tropical birds such as cockatiels and parrots are sensitive to sudden drops in temperature and can develop hypothermia in environments that seem comfortable to humans. Environmental preparation means knowing the physiological limits of the specific animal you have at home and having a plan to maintain the minimum necessary conditions within those limits. For animals sensitive to heat, this may mean having an improvised cooling area, knowing how to use water and natural ventilation efficiently, and recognizing the early signs of heat stress. For animals sensitive to cold, it means having blankets, thermally insulated transport carriers, and a plan to keep the temperature of the animal's sleeping area within safe parameters. The fifth axis is mobility, and here most people discover too late that they are not prepared. In crises that require evacuation, whether due to direct risks such as flooding or fire, or due to deteriorating local conditions such as prolonged absence of water or food, the ability to move with the animal makes the difference between having options and having none. The most common mistake is not having the right equipment. A transport carrier appropriate to the animal's current size, not to the size it was 2 years ago. Collars and leashes in good condition. Animal documentation, including the vaccination record, medical prescriptions, and a recent photograph proving ownership, which may be required at emergency shelters. A compact emergency kit with food, water, medication, and hygiene items sufficient for 72 hours. The second mistake is not having a destination. Before any crisis, the owner needs to know which emergency shelters in the area accept animals, which hotels or guest houses have a pet-friendly policy, and which friends or family members in other areas can receive both the person and the animal. Discovering this information in the middle of an evacuation, when stress is at its peak and options are minimal, is one of the most difficult situations a pet owner can face. The third mistake is underestimating the animal's behavior under stress. A dog that is docile and social in everyday life may become aggressive or extremely anxious in an evacuation situation. This is not unpredictable. It is expected. And preparing for that behavior includes having appropriate handling equipment, knowing the animal's anxiety triggers, and in some cases, having discussed with the veterinarian the possibility of anxiolytic medication for emergency use. There is an aspect of animal preparation that goes beyond the inventory of items and touches on something more fundamental: the relationship between the owner and the animal as an interdependent system. Under normal conditions, this interdependence functions almost automatically. The owner meets the animal's needs, the animal responds with stable behavior, and the cycle maintains itself without conscious effort. Under crisis conditions, the system needs to operate deliberately. The owner is under stress, resources are limited, routine has been disrupted, and the animal, which does not understand what is happening, responds to the owner's stress and to the chaos of the environment with its own signals of distress: changes in appetite, alterations in sleep patterns, destructive behavior, excessive vocalization, self-mutilation in extreme cases. This creates a negative feedback loop that can be very difficult to interrupt if the owner is not prepared to recognize it. The distressed animal increases the owner's stress. The stressed owner worsens their responses to the animal. The cycle deepens. Interrupting that cycle begins with knowledge. Knowing that this pattern exists, knowing how to recognize the early signs of distress in the specific animal you have at home, and knowing which simple interventions, such as maintaining the feeding routine even when general schedules are disrupted, offering safe and familiar spaces, reducing exposure to stressful stimuli, can attenuate the spiral before it takes hold. There is a persistent myth in domestic preparedness culture that needs to be dismantled with clarity: the idea that domestic animals are naturally resilient and that ultimately they figure it out. This belief is partly derived from a confusion between domestic animals and wild animals. Wild animals have adaptation mechanisms developed over millennia to deal with scarcity, environmental variation, and threats. Domestic animals, especially after generations of selection for human dependency behaviors, have lost much of these mechanisms. A domestic dog that depends on industrialized food and a structured routine does not have the capacity to hunt, forage, or regulate its temperature the way a wild animal does. This is not a criticism of domestication. It is a statement about the physiological and behavioral reality of the animals that live in human homes. And ignoring that reality, for whatever reason, including the romanticization of animal resilience, creates real vulnerabilities that have real consequences. Domestic animals survive crises when their owners plan for that to happen. Not through spontaneity, not through instinct, through preparation. A dimension frequently overlooked in animal crisis planning is the question of reproduction and population control. In scenarios of prolonged infrastructure collapse, the birth control of domestic animals ceases to be a matter of convenience and becomes a matter of resources. A pair of unsterilized cats can produce dozens of kittens within a matter of months. Under normal conditions, this is manageable with adoption and veterinary control. In a prolonged crisis, each additional animal is an additional demand for food, water, and medical care. And newborn kittens, especially from young cats, have extremely high mortality rates without adequate care. Spaying and neutering domestic animals is not merely a public health issue or a matter of population control in normal times. It is also a preparedness measure that reduces the complexity of care in stressful situations. A neutered animal has a lower tendency to escape during moments of chaos, a lower tendency toward aggressive territorial behavior, and a lower risk of certain medical conditions that would require urgent veterinary intervention. We have arrived at the point where analysis needs to be converted into operational clarity, not into lists of items to purchase, but into principles that guide decisions under pressure. The first principle is that of active anticipation. Real preparation begins before the crisis, not during it. Every element of vulnerability identified in advance, whether the food supply, medication, documentation, or emergency kit, can be resolved calmly and at reasonable cost. The same elements, when sought during a crisis, cost more, are less available, and require decisions under pressure that frequently produce suboptimal results. The second principle is that of specificity. Preparing for the animal is different from preparing for the specific animal you have at home, with their specific needs, their specific health conditions, their specific behavior. A generic pet preparation plan has limited value. A plan built from detailed knowledge of the real animal that depends on you has real value. The third principle is that of integration. Preparation for animals is not a separate module from general domestic preparedness. It is part of the same system. Decisions about water supply, evacuation plans, emergency kits, and alternative destinations need to incorporate the needs of animals from the outset, not as an afterthought. The fourth principle is that of continuous review. A plan made once and never revisited is a plan that is already outdated. Animals change, age, and develop new health conditions. Available resources change. Family circumstances change. The plan needs to be reviewed regularly, at least every 6 months, to reflect current reality. There is one final dimension of this topic that deserves attention. What to do when preparation is insufficient and the crisis is already underway. The honest answer is that when the crisis has already arrived and preparation was not made, the options are fewer. But they are not non-existent, and knowing these options clearly is better than not knowing them at all. Regarding food, when commercial pet food is not available, there are alternatives that can be used for short periods without serious harm to most healthy adult animals. For dogs, plain cooked animal protein, such as chicken or fish without seasoning, combined with simple carbohydrates such as white rice, can substitute for kibble for a few days. For cats, which are strict carnivores, animal protein is even more critical, and the absence of taurine in the diet can cause cardiac problems within just a few days. This means that the window of dietary improvisation for cats is significantly narrower than for dogs. Regarding medication, when the stock has run out and the veterinarian is inaccessible, the only real option is symptom management, with whatever is available while access to the correct medication is sought. This requires prior knowledge of the signs of deterioration in the animal's condition and of basic veterinary first aid procedures. Improvisation without knowledge in this context is more likely to cause harm than to solve the problem. Regarding environment, when conditions become incompatible with the animal's survival, such as extreme heat without ventilation or intense cold without heating, the only real solution is a change of environment. This may mean moving the animal to another part of the house, to a neighbor's or family member's home, or in extreme cases, to a shelter that accepts animals. This decision is far easier to make when the alternative destination has already been identified in advance. When a real crisis sets in, most people discover that they had more resources than they thought in some areas, and far fewer than they needed in others. The asymmetry between what was planned and what was necessary is the primary vector of suffering, for humans and for the animals that depend on them. What changes when planning is done in advance and with specificity is not the crisis itself. The crisis happens regardless. What changes is the maneuvering room available within it. The difference between having 30 days of food supply and having 3 days is not merely quantitative. It is the difference between being able to observe the situation calmly and make considered decisions, or being in panic mode, scrambling to solve an urgent problem at the worst possible moment to solve it. The animals that survive prolonged crises do not survive by chance. They survive because someone, before anything happened, decided to treat them as real dependents within a real plan, not as magical beings that figure it out, not as emotional variables to be resolved later, but as living beings with concrete physiological needs, within a system of care that must function even when everything around it stops. That decision is not expensive. It is not complex. It does not require inaccessible specialized knowledge. It requires attention and anticipation, two resources that are available right now, before anything happens, and that become scarce precisely when they are most needed. Preparation for animals in crises is not a gesture of love. It is an act of responsibility. And like every act of real responsibility, it needs to happen before the need arises. Because afterward, it is not preparation. It is improvisation. And improvisation, with a dependent living being waiting for you, is the most difficult situation a pet owner can face.